Still says off. Hey, welcome to our Week 8 Hangout. I hope there are lots of you out there. Why don't you send us a tweet so we know you're there. So this is Week 8, and there's been some really interesting discussion on the discussion forums. I'm really pleased to see the progress that people are making. It seems like people are chugging along, and we're getting some new people who are even just starting now, and I think that's just great. And I really would like to strongly encourage people not to feel any pressure to catch up, because these resources are just available to you, and you should just take advantage of it. And we'd just like to see people learning and benefiting from these things that we put together for you. So how are you doing, Dragon?
Yeah, I'm doing great, really. It's exciting. It's really exciting to see that there are some new fresh blood in the course, that some people are really doing well in the course in terms of their start, and they are getting there. Also, it's quite refreshing to see some students who are jumping directly into the topics that they are interested in rather than just going through the entire sequence. Although, of course, it's great if everybody can manage to go through the sequence, but we design the course in such a way that we can cater to different interests and different people who may have basically different approaches or different needs. So that's really great. The other really great point is to see that discussions are quite active, especially edX discussion forums are really active. I think also has to do at least partially with the instructional design that Carolyn suggested in these couple of weeks, especially by encouraging those discussions, by offering to share the goals and what to do with all that. Obviously, there are still some individuals and having some issues, if I'm not mistaken, with the overall accumulation of the points with the marking. But I would say that, be assured that that will not be a problem as long as you accumulate all these competencies and provide the evidence inside of the boxes that are available in edX. You will not miss to get the certificate in the end of the course. So I would really not be worried about that. Probably it's a technological glitch that will be fixed, but in any case, whoever provides enough self-assessed evidence that they completed a course, they will get the certificate that is advertised that this course will offer. So please, let us know if you experience any problems once the course is finished, but I would really not worried about that. And I think the deadline for submitting all these competencies and the evidence that edX actually promised is December the 22nd. So the time is soon and approaching. On the other note, in terms of these discussions, it's really kind of interesting that many students are actually diving into text mining. And obviously, many different students have different issues with text mining. But it seems to me that obviously the couple of weeks that we had also data mining and predictive modeling with Ryan probably helped a bit to set the stage to at least digest some of the terminology that students are dealing with. Also, I guess many students already got kind of used to reinstalling Java for every new piece of technology that we are using in the course. And obviously, that in a way, at least to me, creates last couple of weeks a bit smoother than it was maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago. So that's really great. On the other note, I guess, it would be really interesting now, Carolyn, to see what's happening inside of these discussions once we start applying some text mining to the analysis of this course. So I'm sure, Carolyn, you have some neat ideas, and obviously I'm sure also you would like to use light side in some of those ideas. So what's your current thinking?
Well, we're really interested in monitoring expression and exposure to confusion over time. One of my graduate students has been doing an extensive analysis of this in some Coursera MOOCs, and the interesting finding that she has come to is that it seems actually more damaging to be exposed to other people's confusion than the confusion that you express. It could just be that people don't express all their confusion, but if they're confused, they tend to be drawn towards conversations where other people are talking about their confusion. But in any case, when we look at analyses of attrition over time, we see a far stronger effect of what the confusion that's around students. And so we would like to apply that analysis that we've done to some other MOOCs also to this MOOC, and also to see how some of our help affordances and support and collaboration affordances have related to that? Have they mitigated any of the confusion? Have they made students feel any more secure in the face of some expressed confusion around them? So that's some of the interesting work that we plan to follow up on.
Okay, can I ask a quick question, Caroline? Obviously, and also it's related to the topic of this week as well, and for example, in terms of confusion, and to what extent do you plan or have you used already text mining? And potentially, what kind of features have you so far used for detection of confusion inside of these messages if you apply text mining?
Yeah, we did apply text mining, but it wasn't purely text mining. So my student, Dee Young, she's the one who's been taking the lead on that work. She used a combination of linguistic features and also click features. So she looked at what were people working on and what kind of sequences of behaviors did they engage in before they posted a message. And that helped to disambiguate some of what we saw in the text. And we were trying to make a really subtle distinction between just asking a question or showing that you don't know versus really feeling like you had hit an impasse and not knowing how to move forward. And it was really the second one that we were trying to isolate. And she actually has a paper about this that was just accepted for publication at the Learning at Scale conference for this year. And you know, I actually don't remember in detail exactly which linguistic features were most important, but I do know it's in the write-up. So be on the lookout for that paper when it comes out.
Right, and Caroline, I mean, on the same note, I remember reading carefully your recent paper also published in iRodel, in which you applied another text analysis method as well. You actually developed a new method, which built upon LDA, which is another text analysis method for identification of the topics. And that basically result, to me, looked quite consistent with what we already kind of know from existing educational research, and also what you just suggest now is that in many cases you looked over there the problem of attrition, but in many cases the students was typically just procedural questions, like for example, what's the next assignment, or where do I need to click next, or how do I find, for example, this video, etc. And even I can tell you based on my just anecdotal experience from teaching online courses, which are up to 30 students, 4 credit with tuition fee students. The very first week I started getting those types of questions from some students, I know that those students are at big risk.
Yeah, well, so I do recall that at the beginning of this course there was quite a lot of confusion about how to use the environment and find things, and just confusion over how things had been organized. And I find that what's really challenging about the scale in a MOOC is that you never know when you have everyone's attention, or you never know where to place that clarifying comment so that everyone will see it. And so you sort of feel like the confusion gets a little bit away from you sometimes. But I do recall that when we were analyzing patterns of communication in Twitter, the discussion forums, and in the chats, and comparing across weeks, we did see less confusion over time. That there was a big drop, especially in the chat discussions, about how much discussion about confusion over course procedures there was. So I took that as a good sign that people were getting their questions out and they were working out those issues. But I think that we all learned a lot from listening to the feedback and questions that we'll definitely take to heart as we do some redesign and prepare for subsequent deployments of these materials.
Okay, no, that's really exciting, Caroline. And obviously in this week you are also introducing many different advanced features, right? And it's really kind of it's always a challenging problem whenever you have a new data set or a new classification classifier you like to develop. It always requires additional types of features that may be relevant and which are completely irrelevant in some other cases, but in a new case it becomes really so important. So for example, one of the problems that we are looking at is the level of critical thinking inside of online discussions, especially from the perspective of problem solving. And how students go through different phases of problem solving when they are discussing different messages. And what we basically, I mean, we try to use some of these existing linguistic analysis engines. Like, for example, there's one which is coming from a lab at University of Texas, Austin, which is called, it's pronounced at least LOOC, and which stands for Linguistic Inquiry. Yeah, word count. And when we basically compare, just perform basic statistical analysis, and we wanted to see the level of this kind of critical thinking, we use the common coding scheme for these types of things. We found actually quite a funny result, that only word count mattered. Right? So out of all many different sophisticated features that they may have, like for example identifying cognitive words, perceptual words, emotional words, positive, etc., we just found that, for example, in our case at least, it was related to word count. And I mean, many will actually tell you that even for automated essay grading, and I'm sure, Caroline, you know much more about these types of things, in many cases just simple word count explains much the variability of the final outcome. So can you tell us, at least according to your experience, about some of these very simple types of features that can get us along?
I think I'm really glad that you raised this issue, actually, because it's an important thing to consider. So first of all, let's think about some of these word counting methods like LOOC. You know, very widely known. If you look at James Pennebaker's work with LOOC, he's the one who has led this whole empire, who developed these tools. Actually, he did an excellent job putting this tool together. It was very rigorous how he developed it. It was based on huge amounts of data, using validated questionnaires, data that was collected under controlled circumstances, carefully done factor analyses, and he created these scales. Now, I have no problem with these scales, especially the way that he uses them in his research. Typically, he does studies. I guess the ones that I'm most familiar with are the expressive writing studies, where he's studying, for example, trying to get your frustration out or your stress. So he would, you know, an example of one of these studies is, you know, all the subjects are freshmen at the same university, half of them assigned to a condition where they're writing an essay about what was stressful for them coming to their first year of undergrad, and the second one about some random topic. And then what they do is they look at, well, the students who were in the expressive writing condition, did they have fewer doctor's appointments or whatever, visits to student health than the control condition? And then what they do is they use these LOOC indicators to try to explain the variance. So what they're trying to do is show that in the expressive writing condition, people expressed, they did more self-disclosure, and the extent to which they engaged in that self-disclosure behavior predicted something about you know, the reduction in doctor's visits. Now, you'll see across a series of their papers that that they do find that these scales, and often they're meaningful scales, and they can make a nice story about why those scales made the prediction that they did. But it's also just a little bit questionable to me that across studies, it's not the same scales that make the same prediction, and there are a lot of them. So, you know, well, why isn't it consistent? You have to wonder. And then, okay, but I can still buy that there's something to those stories. I think that there's a certain amount of truth. But then what I see people doing is taking those LOOC indicators and applying them in places where it's completely invalid to do so. And let me explain why. So, for example, I personally believe that to take those LOOC indicators and to apply them to discussion forum data and think that you're actually measuring these scales as they're labeled it's completely invalid. And the reason is that there are so many different factors that affect people's lexical choice. There's lots of personal characteristics. There's the topic that you're discussing. There's who you're responding to. And so even within the thread that you're talking in, the person who starts that thread sets the tone, and that will have a huge maybe huge is an overstatement, but a significant impact on lexical choice throughout the thread for everyone who participates in that thread. And we see that over and over and over again in analyses across discussion forums. So all of these things being the case, then you know that it may be the case that within that data there is something to the fact that something about the choice of those words is being influenced by the factors that they're supposed to represent, but there are so many other things that the numbers that you're getting, you can't separate them. They're very confounded. And so then you can't, for example, use them to rate posts according to how much cognitive effort did somebody put in. It's not going to give you that, because these words, the choice of them, it's being affected not just by that cognitive effort, but by lots of other things that are going on simultaneously. So language is, it's incredibly rich, it's incredibly complex, and if you want to be able to use some of these simple methods in a meaningful way, you have to control for the other factors. But, you know, if you just take a pile of posts, you're really not doing that.
And those are great suggestions, Caroline, and great, insight in this whole process. Because in many cases, I think you really hit the nail in the head here by saying, like, in group dynamics, and this doesn't really just apply, I would say, to language itself, but any type of analytics we do. We often forget that there are contextual factors that need to be accounted for if we want to make a meaningful interpretation of any sorts of analytics, right? So especially discussion boards are really relevant, right? So as you say, someone will jump in and solve a problem. And obviously the information we get exposed to is defining the conditions of our task. And while one group, or for example, this course offering may have certain group of participants which bring some sort of insight or background, another time when we offer the same course, we will not get the same group dynamics, for sure, because students will be coming from different perspectives in that particular case, and therefore the conditions in which they are learning are changing. And obviously, this is something that we found actually when we discussed and when we looked into these discussion boards, is that we need to really account for some of these contextual features. And obviously, like when we are discussing when we are looking into discussion boards, that basically the question becomes of the temporal pattern or the temporality when certain message arrived, whether that was the first message or the last message in the discussion board. And that's what we exactly found that would be really an important contributing factor. Obviously, there would be additional types of features that we need to account for. And I think you, Caroline, also did quite some work in terms of the level of authority that certain participant may get inside of certain discussions. And obviously, that level of authority that participant may take may influence everybody else inside of discussion boards. And do you actually currently have any findings in terms of language and potential influence on the types of potential features or any linguistic features that might be relevant inside of your studies so far?
Gee, that's such a big question. Yes is the answer. So I would say that always there are lots of factors that are affecting which linguistic features are going to be associated with things that you're interested in, variables, either about the people or about the situation. And as you pointed out, authority, relative authority. And when we say that, what we really mean is positioning yourself as a source of valuable information or action in an interaction, or a recipient. So being a source is a more authoritative stance. And what we see is that when students come together, they adjust to the relative level that they sense. So you come into a group and everyone is projecting sort of their view of themselves, and then people adjust to the view of their partners, because all they really know is that view that's being projected, and so they place themselves in relation to that. And you can see evidence of that in lots of different linguistic behaviors. And as we have worked on our analysis, we have drawn very heavily from systemic functional linguistics, where there has been a really deep investigation not only into the linguistic aspects, but also the sociological ones. So what I really like about systemic functional linguistics is it's a linguistic theory that kind of has its own brother sociological theory, which is Bernstein's sociological theory. Those two communities really sort of grew up side by side. And so you can see in their work such rich acknowledgement of all the social contextualization of lots of linguistic choices at different levels. So I feel like I'm babbling a bit, but the idea really is that it's always the case that you have to look very deeply at the reasons why people are making their choices. What's complicated is that it's so contextual that in one community, the things that signal that you're moving into a position of authority might be different than they are in a different community. And some of it is because these linguistic choices have a kind of symbolic character. And so within communities, just as we establish together lots of other kinds of practices that we engage in, we also formulate and then engage in these linguistic practices that influence the linguistic choices that we make. And to the extent that lots of things that we're interested as learning analytics researchers in measuring touch upon these sort of symbolic aspects of how we relate to each other, we have to realize that that means that there isn't a kind of necessary connection between the language features and what it is that we're trying to measure, but it's mediated through kind of a layer of culture in some sense. And you know, even how you express your thinking and what marks your cognitive engagement, this can also be culturally influenced. And so because of that, depending upon the community where you're doing that measurement, you might have to look for slightly different things. So you'll notice in one of my lectures for week 8, I talk about getting a sense of your data. And in that lecture, we kept it pretty basic, but it's always, always, always the case that it's not about that you have these magic feature extractors or, you know, that they're going to really do a lot of work for you by themselves, but it really takes you in the context in which you're working, thinking deeply about what it is about the language that you're trying to capture and looking at how it plays out in those contexts, and then thinking about what clues you see that relate to some of the kinds of basic patterns that we can extract. And so you want to include those things that you think are going to get triggered by the clues that you as a human see. So that's the connection between you as a human and the tool. So I hope that answers your question, Dragon. I think it's a really big question.
Yeah, no, I understand, and I think this is a really great experience that you are sharing with us, and I think this is really important. I think it is important from the perspective of the language itself, but I think it's also very important for any topic we touch in educational research in general. We need to carefully account for contextual factors. I think Ryan also talked, I don't know if maybe in these Hangouts or not, but his team developed this whole software for studying science, math, I think, assessments, and they observed one type of patterns, how students engage with that technology in the US, in many different mid-schools. And then when they deployed that same technology in Mexico, students actually use it in a completely different way.
Yeah.
They actually start collaborating, although the technology itself wasn't designed to be collaborative, and they were basically seated in the same conditions. But it really explains the culture. And we also, I mean, myself as a trained computer scientist, I always kind of think culture is something just typically associated with a certain ethnicity or certain geographical region and so on. But actually, even our profession defines some culture. Different types of even describe. Exactly, our institutions. So each of us is actually just like a intersect of many different cultures, professional, cultural, interest-based, and many different, but even technology-driven, right? So certain technologies are also shaping the type of culture that we are actually expressing and we are dealing with. But in all these types of things, Carolyn, there is always a big challenge, and I think some of the students also raised this question about overfitting many different classifiers. And I remember also one of your papers in the past in which you dealt with also domain-specific terminology, and you actually applied name entity resolution,
Yeah.
if I remember correctly. So could you actually share a bit more experience about that type of work, Carolyn?
Sure. Actually, the work that you're referring to, the first author on that work was Jin Mu, and she was working in Frank Fischer's group in Munich, and they're close collaborators of mine. And they were doing this research where they were trying to monitor argumentative knowledge construction in a psychology class where students were applying a theory to these case studies. And what they found was that the models that were trained on one case study didn't transfer well to other case studies. And so what they tried to do was abstract up a level the features, and that's where the named entity recognition came in. That was one way of doing the abstraction. And in creating these more abstract features, then they were able to create these models that could be applied to other case studies, and they did have evidence that that did increase the generalizability and thus lower the overfitting of their models to a particular context. Now, this is a really active area of research in text mining, and in that article, the journal article version of that work, we reviewed a lot of different ways in the text mining community that that problem of overfitting to a particular domain or subpopulation or just context in general, how to deal with it. It can be dealt with at the level of the features, which is what Jin Mu chose to focus on, and we also have some papers where we have explored different kinds of features that we also would argue give you a little bit more abstraction, but there are also ways that you can build structure into your model so that it knows to anticipate those dependencies between subsets of data, and because of that, the models themselves are also able to separate out those patterns that are particular to a subset of data and those that generalize across the subsets. So I think it's a fascinating area of research. I had a PhD student who did his dissertation in that area, so if there are students out there who want to know more about that, certainly I can pass some resources on.
Oh, and that's really great and really, I mean, exciting type of research. One of the also types of features that we are finding often useful and more recently even more useful is that we are looking into the types of general characteristics of messages, not necessarily just looking into the counting, as you said, or even looking into the domain-specific terminology itself, but rather to look into the, for example, terminological density of the words that are happening in text. So, for example, imagine all the key terms that you may identify in certain message or certain document, and then try to see what type of relationships may exist between those types of words. You can have them very simple, but what we are observing is that typically texts, whether they are discourse, or whether they are even essays, that are more dense, that are actually connecting more dots between different nodes inside of their messages, are actually typically associated with higher level of cognitive processing as well. And that basically is something which is also probably indicative of more learning than less learning. And that's something which is obviously a different types of a feature which is domain independent. However, it's always a challenge then to make any sorts of generalizations. For example, it's one way how computer scientists interact about the types of problems we have. It's typically question answering types of problems, and it's another completely different way how, for example, students from humanities are tackling their problems and the way how they are discussing. And therefore, why I just made this point that we are observing that this density is quite useful for particular types of domains that we are looking into. It might be completely irrelevant in some other domains, right? And
right. Here's what I would suggest you do, Dragan, to follow up on that. I would suggest that what you do is you take your density measure and you apply it to the full set of data points that you have. Then pick out a few that are very, very high and a few that are way on the low end, and then a few in the middle. And now, with your own human eyes, compare them. And think to yourself, what is it that's really different about these things? What is it that this measure is really picking up on in this context? And is it really what you think? Because you could start to tell yourself a lot of stories about why that density measure really matters, but you might be surprised what it is that it's really picking up on. So that's what I would suggest as a follow-up.
No,
So,
and that's a really great suggestion, I think, for the wrap-up of today's discussion. So we eventually end up with many different, beautiful, sophisticated types of features, but we often forget to return back to the source of our basic data and to
yeah, I
return
always
back
encourage people.
where we are coming from. And that's really great advice, I guess, for the wrap-up of today's meeting.
Great. Well, it was so great talking to you all out there, and we have just one more hangout next week, so please come. See you all.
See you all. Bye-bye. Thanks.